The Second World War is a conflict so vast and deeply ingrained in our memory that it feels as though we already know everything about it. Its history is etched into monuments, preserved in millions of official documents, and immortalized through iconic photographs and films that shape our collective understanding. We learn about the sweeping strategies, the pivotal turning points of battles, and the generals who seemed to move armies like pieces on a global chessboard. Yet this familiar version of events, for all its authority and weight, hides something else beneath the surface. Behind the stage of conventional warfare, there existed another shadowy battlefield, one filled with bizarre accidents, inexplicable decisions, and mysteries so strange that they continue to defy explanation even today. This is a world where logic gives way to irony, where fate twists cruelly, where powerful men embark on missions that seem more like delusion than strategy, where mighty ships are destroyed, not by enemy attack, but by a single, careless spark, and where celebrated heroes vanish without a trace. These are the ghost stories of the war, the hidden tales that haunt the official record, and remind us that history is not only about victories and defeats, but about strange accidents, personal obsessions, and the unpredictability of human behavior. They reveal a war that was not only destructive on a massive scale, but also profoundly chaotic, irrational, and deeply human, far more unsettling and curious than the neat accounts of history books would have us believe. To understand one of the strangest episodes of this hidden side of the war, we turn to the night of May 10, 1941, and the extraordinary figure of Rudolf Hess. Hess was not just another Nazi official lost in the ranks of the Third Reich. He had been part of Hitler's inner circle from the very beginning. He marched at Hitler's side during the failed Munich Putsch of 1923, sharing prison with him afterward, and it was Hess who took dictation for Mein Kampf. Hitler rewarded this loyalty by elevating him to the position of deputy Führer, formerly the second man in the Reich, the one who acted as the conscience of the Nazi Party and the gatekeeper to Hitler himself. Yet by 1941, the brutal realities of power had begun to push him aside. Ruthless rivals like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Himmler steadily eroded his influence. At the same time, Hess's eccentric personality became more pronounced. He was deeply fascinated by astrology, mysticism, herbal remedies, and unconventional forms of knowledge, often seeking advice from sources that seemed outlandish even to his contemporaries. These tendencies, combined with his growing irrelevance in the political machinery of the Reich, left him desperate to regain importance and prove his worth to Hitler. He became increasingly obsessed with an idea: securing peace with Britain. Against all reason, Hess convinced himself that within the British aristocracy there was a powerful faction waiting for an opportunity to overthrow Churchill and strike a deal with Germany. If only he could reach them, he believed the war in the West could be ended, and Germany's eastern ambitions unleashed. The timing of this obsession was crucial. Germany was preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the monumental invasion of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, eliminating the danger of a two-front war had always been a priority, and Hess imagined that by single-handedly arranging peace with Britain, he could present his Führer with an unparalleled gift: the security of the West, allowing Germany to focus all its strength on the conquest of the East. On the evening of May 10, 1941, this dream drove Hess to take one of the most extraordinary personal gambles of the war. At 47 years old, and with little recent flying experience, he climbed into a specially prepared Messerschmitt Bf 110 twin-engine aircraft. Carrying with him maps, charts, and a portfolio of his peace proposals, he took off from Augsburg, flying northwest over Germany and then across the North Sea. To avoid British radar, he flew low over the waves, navigating in the fading light by the landmarks he remembered from old flying days. For hours he was alone in the cockpit, a solitary figure on a mission that seemed both audacious and insane. Flying not only toward Britain but toward a destiny that neither he nor anyone else could fully imagine. After nearly 5 hours in the air, battling exhaustion and dwindling fuel, Hess reached the coast of Scotland. The darkness, the fatigue, and his lack of recent flying skill forced him into a desperate decision. Falling short of his intended destination, he bailed out of the aircraft and parachuted into a field near the village of Eaglesham, spraining his ankle on landing. It was there, in the quiet of the Scottish countryside, that he was discovered by a local farmer named David McLean, who confronted the downed pilot with nothing more than a pitchfork. Hess at first gave a false name, calling himself Hauptmann Alfred Horn, but his identity as Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, quickly emerged. The revelation stunned everyone. His intended destination had been Dungerville House, the estate of the 14th Duke of Hamilton. Hess believed that the Duke, whom he claimed to have met briefly during the Berlin Olympics in 1936, was the key figure in connecting him to Britain's supposed peace faction. When the Duke was summoned and met Hess the following day, the encounter only deepened the strangeness of the situation. Hess laid out his proposal. Germany would be allowed to dominate continental Europe, and in return, Britain's empire would be safeguarded. It was a fantasy, detached entirely from the realities of war. The Duke, a loyal RAF officer and trusted ally of Churchill, listened with politeness but quickly recognized that Hess was not a serious emissary. He seemed rambling, at times incoherent, and utterly disconnected from the reality of Britain's determination to resist. Moreover, Hess made it clear that he had acted entirely on his own initiative, denying any authorization from Hitler. In that single admission, Hess destroyed any chance of being treated as a diplomatic envoy. Instead, he became what he would remain for the rest of the war, a very unusual and very high-profile prisoner of war. In Britain, officials were bewildered. In Berlin, Hitler's fury was explosive. At his mountain retreat, witnesses described his reaction as an almost animalistic outburst of rage. The Nazi leadership fell into panic. Fearing that Churchill would exploit Hess's presence to sow distrust among Germany's allies, the propaganda machine went into immediate action. Within hours, German broadcasts declared that Hess was mentally unstable, a man suffering from delusions who had acted in a fit of madness. His name was erased from public life, his titles stripped, and Bormann moved swiftly to consolidate the power Hess had left behind. Hitler himself, privately enraged, even ordered that Hess's plane be shot down, though by then it was far too late. This narrative of madness served both sides. For Germany, it explained away the embarrassment of such a prominent defection, and the dangerous implications of a high-ranking Nazi seeking peace with the enemy. For Britain, declaring Hess insane made it easy to dismiss his proposals without treating them as legitimate, and allowed him to be held as a prisoner without the diplomatic complications of dealing with an envoy. Churchill himself later described Hess's flight as a deed of lunatic benevolence, implying that, however misguided, Hess may have genuinely believed he was acting for the greater good. Yet, despite this convenient explanation, the British did not treat him merely as a madman. On the contrary, Hess became one of their most closely studied prisoners. He was interrogated by intelligence officers, examined by psychological experts, and moved between various secure locations, including a period of confinement in the Tower of London. Far from dismissing him as irrelevant, Britain treated Hess as a man whose motives might conceal hidden truths, a puzzle to be unraveled. His strange mission, and the question of why he really attempted it, has never ceased to fascinate. Did Hess carry with him secret knowledge of Germany's most dangerous plan, the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, or was he acting purely out of delusion? The British interrogators tasked with unraveling his motives were left exasperated, for the man they questioned was unpredictable and unsettling. At times he could seem lucid, rational, even persuasive, but these moments quickly collapsed into long spells of paranoia and confusion. He complained constantly that his captors were poisoning his food, that invisible rays were being directed at him to torment his mind, and he developed a consuming fear of illness, convinced he was the victim of endless hidden ailments. His instability deepened so rapidly that on June 16, 1941, just weeks after his arrival on British soil, he attempted to end his life by hurling himself down a staircase. The attempt failed, leaving him alive but with a broken leg, and for many, who already believed he was unhinged, This act seemed to prove their case beyond doubt. Yet the alternative theory, the possibility that Hess had acted not as a delusional rogue but as a sanctioned messenger carrying out a secret plan, never entirely faded. In fact, decades later, it gained unexpected strength. In 2011, a 28-page statement emerged from Karl-Heinz Pinch, Hess's longtime aide and adjutant. Pinch had been captured and interrogated by the Soviets, and during his imprisonment, he declared that Hitler not only knew of Hess's mission, but had reacted with composure when told of his deputy's departure. According to Pinch, the entire plan had been designed as a gamble with plausible deniability. If Hess succeeded in reaching sympathetic British aristocrats, then peace talks could begin. If he failed, Hitler could disown him, claim insanity, and distance the Reich from the fiasco. And that is precisely what had happened. Yet despite the intrigue of this account, mainstream historians remain deeply skeptical. Pinch's testimony was given under Soviet custody, with every likelihood of coercion or outright torture, and Moscow had obvious reasons to encourage the idea of secret collusion between the Nazis and certain elements of the British elite. Furthermore, Pinch's version clashed sharply with the recollections of those close to Hitler, who had witnessed his explosion of fury when the truth emerged. To them, the idea that Hitler had calmly approved the plan seemed absurd. Still, the mystery refused to die. Rudolf Hess became a permanent enigma, a man whose intentions could never be pinned down with certainty. He stood trial at Nuremberg, where he confounded the court by feigning amnesia for months, only to suddenly regain his memory later. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he became one of history's strangest symbols. For 20 years he lived in near-total isolation as the sole inmate of Berlin's Spandau prison, a living ghost of the regime that had collapsed around him. Even in death he refused to be free of mystery. In 1987, at the age of 93, he died in his cell. The official account, declaring it suicide by hanging, yet almost immediately conspiracy theories arose, claiming he had been murdered to silence him. He had never provided a coherent or consistent explanation for his flight to Scotland. To some, he was a man deranged, lost in fantasy and delusion. To others, he was a loyal soldier carrying out a mission so secret that even his own disgrace had been built into the plan, and to many he seemed to embody the most unsettling possibility of all that he was both. A man balanced between obsession and purpose, between madness and method, leaving behind a legacy that blurred the line between truth and delusion. While Hess lingered in prison, another story of wartime tragedy had unfolded years earlier. Not in the skies over Britain, but in the waters of New York Harbor. Before she was reduced to ashes and ruin, she had been a miracle of design, a masterpiece of peace and ambition. The SS Normandie, launched in 1935, was more than a passenger ship. She was a national statement, a floating symbol of French brilliance in engineering and artistry, an embodiment of pride, power, and elegance. For a brief but dazzling moment, she was the queen of the seas, the largest and fastest passenger liner in the world, seizing the blue ribbon from her rivals with record-breaking Atlantic crossings. Her long, sleek profile suggested speed and strength, but it was within her halls that she astonished the world. The first-class dining room stretched longer than the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Its glittering Art Deco interior, adorned with towering glass columns that seemed to glow from within. She carried nearly 2,000 passengers in a level of luxury no ship had ever matched. Served by a crew of more than 1,300. To walk her decks was to encounter Hollywood stars, industrial, magnates, and European royalty, all gathered within a vessel that seemed like a palace at sea. She embodied the optimism of a world still clinging to its belief in progress and connection. A ship as much a symbol of international harmony as it was of French pride. Yet this golden era was short-lived. By late August 1939, as war darkened Europe, the Normandy was docked in New York. Days later, Germany invaded Poland, and with Britain and France declaring war, the great liner was ordered to remain where she was, in the safety of neutral American waters. She would never see her home port of Le Havre again. For months she remained majestic, but silent at Pier 88. Later joined by the British giants RMS Queen Mary and RMS Queen Elizabeth, the three largest and most powerful passenger ships in the world stood side by side on the Hudson River. Magnificent yet motionless, awaiting a storm none of them could avoid. When France fell in June 1940, the Normandie passed into the ownership of the collaborationist Vichy regime, and American officials grew uneasy. They feared sabotage, or worse, a plot by German agents to take the ship by force. U.S. Coast Guard guards were stationed on board, working with the small French crew who continued to maintain her complex systems, including her state-of-the-art fire safety equipment. For more than 2 years the ship remained idle but safe, a sleeping giant of steel and glass. Then came December 7, 1941, and the world shifted again. With Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and America's sudden entry into the war, the Normandie was transformed overnight from a neutral guest to a potential weapon of immense value. She could no longer be left untouched. On December 12, 1941, just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government seized her under the doctrine of Angary, a wartime law that allowed nations to appropriate neutral property within their borders. The Navy took possession and renamed her USS Lafayette, a tribute to the French general who had once helped secure America's independence. The plans for her were ambitious and immediate: to strip away the luxury and transform her into a troopship capable of carrying over 10,000 soldiers across the Atlantic in a single voyage. The urgency was immense, the need desperate, and the timeline impossibly tight. American shipyards were already drowning in work, repairing damaged vessels and producing new warships at a frantic pace. The decision was made to convert the Normandie right where she stood, at Pier 88. The great liner, once the most glamorous vessel afloat, was now engulfed in scaffolding, welding sparks, crates, and clattering machinery. The work was hurried, the pressure enormous, and amidst the frenzy, the seeds of catastrophe were quietly being sown. Hundreds of civilian contractors poured onto the vessel, working side by side with Navy personnel in a chaotic atmosphere where orders overlapped and lines of authority blurred. The ship that had once been a palace of the seas, adorned with Lalique glass, priceless furniture, and irreplaceable artworks, was being stripped bare in haste. Carpenters, welders, and laborers carted away treasures with little care, dismantling her beauty piece by piece. In their place, bunks, mess halls, and gun mounts were crudely installed, transforming a marvel of luxury into a blunt tool of war. The pressure to complete the conversion before the mid-February deadline was suffocating, and safety measures that had once been a point of pride were ignored or bypassed. The most devastating lapse lay in the handling of her fire protection system. The Normandie had been equipped with one of the most advanced firefighting networks of its time, but during the conversion, it was shut down. To compound the danger, the ship's hydrants were designed to French standards, and the crucial adapters to make them compatible with American firefighting equipment had not yet been fitted. This meant that if a fire broke out, the New York Fire Department would be helpless. It was a blunder of staggering proportions, the kind of mistake that seemed to invite disaster. All it required now was a spark. The bitterly cold afternoon of February 9, 1942, began as just another frantic day of work. Inside the once glorious Grand Salon, a team of welders chipped away at the last remnants of the ship's former life, cutting down decorative stanchions that had once supported a hall rivaling Versailles in grandeur. At about 2:30, a welder named Clement Derrick worked with an acetylene torch, the hiss and roar of the flame echoing in the hollowed-out space. As he sliced into a base of metal, a shower of sparks scattered into the air, floating downward in a glowing rain. Just yards away, stacked carelessly by other workers, lay thousands of life vests. They were filled with kapok, a fibrous plant, material known for its buoyancy but also highly flammable, and wrapped tightly in burlap. The instant a spark landed, the vests burst into flame as though drenched in oil. In moments, the blaze spread, racing across the pile, feeding hungrily on the kapok and burlap. Men shouted in panic, fumbling for extinguishers and beating at the fire with coats, but the inferno spread faster than they could react. A fierce westerly wind funneled through the open portholes and whipped the flames into a storm that leaped across the ship's grand wooden interiors. The alarm bells rang out, but the ship's elaborate sprinkler system remained useless. Shut down during the conversion, smoke and fire filled the salon, blackening its carved panels and swallowing the remnants of its former glory. Outside, the rising plume of thick smoke soon towered above the city, visible across Manhattan, sending a wave of alarm through the streets below. The New York Fire Department answered the call with remarkable speed. Engines and ladder trucks screamed into place. Fireboats churned in the Hudson, but when firefighters rushed aboard, they discovered a nightmare. Their hoses could not be connected to the ship's hydrants. The adapters were missing. Forced to improvise, they pumped water from the harbor and stretched lines from the pier, fighting desperately to hold back a fire that had already claimed the heart of the ship. As flames devoured room after room, the firefighters poured thousands of gallons onto the decks, slowly bringing the inferno under control by nightfall. Yet in their victory, a new danger was created. The vast quantities of water now sat heavy on the upper decks, an estimated 6,000 tons. With the scuppers clogged by debris, the water could not drain away, and the ship began to lean. The list to port was subtle at first, then more pronounced, until the giant vessel tilted ominously. Toward the pier, naval engineers tried a desperate counterflooding operation, opening valves to balance the weight, but the attempt only worsened the instability. In the still hours after midnight, the sound of straining steel echoed over the Hudson, and at last the order to abandon ship was given. Slowly, inexorably, the Pride of France rolled onto her side, settling into the icy water with her funnels and masts jutting at broken angles above the surface. The once glorious liner, which had carried movie stars and royalty, now lay as a gutted carcass in the harbor. Astonishingly, only one life was lost, but the shame and shock were immeasurable. Official investigations began at once. The FBI and Navy launched exhaustive inquiries, interrogating workers and engineers, seeking to determine if the disaster had been accident or sabotage. Clement Derrick, the unlucky welder, was brought back and asked to repeat his actions. Before the eyes of investigators, sparks from his torch once again leaped onto a pile of kapok-filled vests, and just as before, they ignited instantly. The conclusion seemed undeniable. The fire was a tragic accident caused by carelessness, negligence, and the crushing haste of war. The case was officially closed. Yet beyond the official reports, rumors spread through the docks and back alleys of New York. A darker explanation took hold, one tied not to enemy agents but to the American underworld. At the center of the whispers stood Charles Lucky Luciano, the imprisoned but still powerful mafia boss. Though behind bars, Luciano's influence on the docks remained unchallenged through his lieutenants, particularly Anthony Anastasio, the feared dock boss of Brooklyn. According to this theory, the fire had not been an accident at all, but a message. By orchestrating such a spectacular blaze, the mob demonstrated to the government that the docks were vulnerable and that only they could guarantee security. Was not sabotage for the enemy, but leverage for themselves. A bold declaration of power disguised as catastrophe, that the idea might have sounded like a crime thriller. But what happened afterward gave the theory weight. Alarmed by the fire and shaken by German U-boats prowling just offshore, American naval intelligence reached out to the very men they once sought to crush. In a clandestine arrangement later revealed as Operation Underworld, the Navy struck a deal with Luciano himself. In exchange for his cooperation, the mob would use its grip on the longshoremen's unions to prevent strikes, root out enemy agents, and keep the docks secure. Luciano was quietly moved to a more comfortable prison, and in 1946 his sentence was commuted, after which he was deported to Italy. Whether the mafia had lit the fire, or simply seized the opportunity, remains one of history's lingering mysteries. No one was ever charged, and no conclusive evidence surfaced, but the circumstantial details remain tantalizing. Did the mob create the disaster to sell the cure, forcing the government into an unholy alliance? Or were they merely opportunists, who benefited from tragedy? Either way, the flames of the Normandy reshaped the balance of power on the New York waterfront and left behind questions that still smolder. While America wrestled with sabotage, rumor, and uneasy alliances, across the Atlantic another drama was unfolding in the endless duel between Germany's U-boats and Britain's convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of the war. A grinding contest where each side measured victory not in ground won but in tonnage, sunk, or saved. The U-boats were hunters of the deep, their commanders lionized as modern knights. And none was more celebrated than Günther Prien, captain of U-47. His fame was born in October 1939, when, in the cold pre-dawn hours, he guided his boat through the blockships and currents guarding Scapa Flow, the heart of Britain's home fleet. With nerves of steel, he slipped past patrols, crept into the anchorage, and unleashed torpedoes at the battleship HMS Royal Oak. The giant ship exploded and sank within minutes. Taking over 800 sailors down with her, Prien guided U-47 back out to sea, as silently as he had entered. The raid was a humiliation for the Royal Navy and a triumph for German propaganda. Hitler himself awarded Prien the Knight's Cross, and the press celebrated him as the Bull of Scapa Flow. A snorting bull emblem was painted on U-47's conning tower, soon adopted as the insignia of the entire 7th U-boat flotilla. For the next 18 months, Prien stalked the Atlantic, sinking more than 30 ships and dealing crushing blows to Allied shipping during the so-called happy time, when U-boats seemed invincible. But by 1941, the tide was shifting. The Allies improved convoy tactics, increased escort strength, and began to deploy ASTIC, an early sonar system, making hunting more dangerous for the predators of the deep. In late February of that year, U-47 sailed from Loyang for its 10th patrol. Prien joined a wolf pack tasked with attacking convoy OB-293 south of Iceland. On the night of March 6th and into the 7th, under cover of darkness, the pack struck. Prien launched torpedoes into the mass of ships, sinking several and crippling a massive 20,000-ton whale factory vessel. But this time the hunters faced prey that fought back. The convoy's escort, including the destroyers HMS Wolverine and HMS Verity and several corvettes, turned with ferocity, depth charges rolling into the sea, explosions shaking the depths. It was the beginning of U-47's last and most mysterious battle. Just after midnight on March 8th, the deadly cat-and-mouse game began. The official Royal Navy reports describe how the destroyers Wolverine and Verity obtained a firm sonar contact on a submerged U-boat. For 5 relentless hours they pursued it through the frigid Atlantic waters, releasing depth charge patterns designed to crush a submarine's hull with concussive blasts. At approximately 5 a.m., lookouts aboard Wolverine reported a fleeting sight of a submarine forced briefly to the surface before diving again. The destroyers pressed their attack, closing in tightly. Suddenly, a violent underwater explosion tore through the depths, sending an orange-red glow boiling to the surface. Silence followed, broken only by the spreading slick of oil. The British crews were convinced they had destroyed U-47, claiming vengeance for the Royal Oak. In Germany, however, U-47 was first marked as overdue, then officially missing. Reluctant to crush morale, the High Command suppressed the news for over 2 months until British propaganda began taunting them with "Where is Prien?" Finally, in late May, the Germans acknowledged his presumed loss. For the remainder of the war, the accepted narrative was that Wolverine had sunk U-47. Yet in the aftermath, careful examination of records from both sides began to unravel that certainty. Evidence showed that the submarine attacked so ferociously by Wolverine and Verity was almost certainly not U-47, but another U-boat from the same wolfpack, UA, commanded by Hans Eckermann. His boat had been heavily damaged in the exact location, and at the precise time of the British assault, but, against all odds, survived to limp back to France. Eckermann's logbooks, preserved after the war, aligned perfectly with the British accounts, making it clear that Wolverine had been battering his submarine, not Prien's. This revelation reignited the mystery. If U-47 was not destroyed by Wolverine, what became of it? The possibilities are many and none entirely conclusive. Some suggest U-47 may have fallen to other convoy escorts, such as the corvettes, HMS Camellia or HMS Arbutus, both of which carried out attacks in the same battle. Others point to the inherent dangers of submarine warfare itself. A catastrophic mechanical failure, flooding, or a battery explosion could easily have sent the vessel to the ocean floor unseen. Perhaps the most chilling theory is that U-47 was undone by its own weapon. German torpedoes at the time were notoriously unreliable, with defective magnetic detonators and faulty guidance systems that occasionally caused them to turn in wide arcs and circle back on their launches. At least 3 documented incidents showed German submarines destroyed by their own torpedoes. Without the discovery of U-47's wreck, the truth remains elusive, and the fate of Prien and his crew endures as one of the great ghost stories of the Battle of the Atlantic. While sailors vanished in the depths, another kind of disappearance shook the war effort on land and in the air. Alongside the clashes of armies and fleets, another war was being waged, a war for morale, for the hearts and spirits of millions. America's secret weapon in that campaign was not a general or a politician, but the sound of Glenn Miller. By the early 1940s, Alton Glenn Miller was more than a bandleader. He was a cultural phenomenon. With his orchestra's distinctive clarinet reed section, he forged a sound that defined an era. Songs such as In the Mood and Moonlight Serenade were not merely hits, but the soundtrack to American life on the cusp of war. From 1939 to 1942, Miller was the top-selling recording artist in the nation, a household name, a millionaire at the height of his fame. In 1942, at the age of 38, with the war intensifying, and despite being too old for the draft, he made a decision that shocked many. He walked away from his immense earnings and celebrity, insisting he could serve his country better with a trombone than with a rifle. Commissioned as a captain in the Army Air Forces, he built the Army Air Forces Orchestra, a 50-piece ensemble. That became the most celebrated military band of the war. His mission was clear: to bring a taste of home to the troops, lifting morale with the joyous swing music that reminded them what they were fighting for. The results were extraordinary. His orchestra toured bases across the United States, filled the airwaves with broadcasts, and became beloved by soldiers and civilians alike. In the summer of 1944, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, Miller brought his band to England, playing in hangars, hospitals, and forward camps. Their BBC and Armed Forces Network broadcasts reached millions, embodying optimism and resolve. His music became a symbol of Allied unity and the belief in eventual victory. By late 1944, with Paris liberated, Miller planned a triumphant series of concerts in the French capital to celebrate Christmas with the troops. On December 15th, he was scheduled to fly ahead of his orchestra to make arrangements. But foul weather blanketed England and Northern Europe in fog and ice, grounding regular transport. Determined not to let the schedule slip, Miller found an alternate path. He secured a seat with his friend Lieutenant Colonel Norman Bessel aboard a small utility aircraft, a UC-64. It was an informal, unauthorized flight, the kind officers often took during the chaos of wartime, bending rules to get where they needed to be. The pilot was Flight Officer John Morgan, tasked with guiding the little plane across the channel. In conditions that grounded larger aircraft, it was the last time anyone saw Glenn Miller alive. Shortly before 2 p.m. The 3 men took off from Raff Twinwood Farm, an airfield in southern England, and headed out over the English Channel. Miller, who was known to be a nervous flyer, reportedly joked with an officer on the ground, asking where the parachutes were. Once the small plane climbed into the thick grey mist, it was never seen or heard from again. For days, confusion reigned. When the rest of the band arrived in Paris by another route, and their leader was not there to meet them, alarm spread quickly. Because the flight had been unauthorized, the military had no official record of it. And it was not until December 23 that the Army Air Forces officially declared the plane missing. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the world received the shocking news that Major Glenn Miller was presumed lost at sea. The man who had given hope to millions through music had vanished without a trace. His final note swallowed by silence and fog. What could have caused the loss of such a small but sturdy plane? The US military concluded that the most probable explanation was a tragic accident. The UC-64 Norseman's engine carburetor was notoriously vulnerable to icing in the damp, freezing conditions they were flying in. Combined with pilot disorientation in the dense fog, a dangerous phenomenon known as vertigo, it is highly likely that the engine failed and the aircraft plunged into the English Channel with no chance of survival. It was a simple, sad, and plausible end to a brilliant career. For decades, this was the accepted story, but it was not the only one. In the 1980s, a British RAF veteran named Fred Shaw made a startling claim. He said that on December 15, 1944, he had been a navigator on a Lancaster bomber returning from an aborted mission over Germany. As standard procedure, his squadron jettisoned their bombs over a designated area of the channel before landing. From his vantage point, Shaw claimed he saw a small single-engine plane flying beneath them, matching the description of a He watched in horror as the aircraft was caught in the explosions of the falling bombs, flipped over, and plunged into the sea. This friendly fire theory was dramatic and haunting. Could Glenn Miller really have been killed by his own side in a tragic accident of fate? While compelling, the account has been met with skepticism. Historians point out that visibility was extremely poor that day, making it unlikely Shaw could have identified such a small aircraft from thousands of feet above. Official records also do not place Miller's plane in the designated bomb drop zone, though wartime flight paths were often unpredictable. Other rumors circulated over the years, claiming Miller had died of a heart attack in Paris, or that his death was tied to a secret intelligence operation. But these have no credible evidence. Ultimately, without the wreckage, the mystery lingers. The official verdict remains a weather-related crash, though it is forever shadowed by the chilling possibility of friendly fire, and the testimony of one man who believed he saw a small plane fall from the sky, while the Allies fought on land, sea, and air. Another fear gnawed at their leaders: the possibility that Nazi Germany might build an atomic bomb. German scientists had been the first to split the atom, and as the war progressed, the Allies assumed their enemies were racing toward the same terrifying goal. This assumption drove the creation of the massive, secret Manhattan Project. Yet the reality of Germany's nuclear program, known as the Uranium Club, was far different. Led by the famous physicist Werner Heisenberg, the German effort was plagued by rivalries, shortages, and strategic miscalculations. Heisenberg and his colleagues focused largely on building a nuclear reactor for power rather than producing the enriched uranium or plutonium needed for a weapon. By late 1944, with Allied armies advancing, the Germans had not even achieved a self-sustaining chain reaction. A special Allied intelligence mission called ORSOS followed the front lines, seizing laboratories and capturing scientists. Their conclusion was clear: Germany had been nowhere close to developing a bomb. This has long been the accepted historical record. Yet a darker counter-narrative persists. In the chaotic final months of the war, when Hitler pinned his hopes on so-called wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket and the jet-powered Me-262, rumors began to swirl of something even more terrifying. The focus of these stories is the Jonostal Valley in Thuringia, central Germany, where the SS oversaw a massive secret construction project using thousands of slave laborers to carve tunnels and chambers into the mountainside. The purpose of this complex remains unknown, but some believe it was linked to nuclear research. At the nearby Ohrdruf military training ground, witnesses claimed that on the night of March 4, 1945, something extraordinary happened. Locals reported seeing a blinding flash of light, brighter than 100 lightning strikes, followed by a strange, shifting glow of red and yellow. Moments later, a powerful blast wave swept through the valley. In the following days, villagers suffered nosebleeds, headaches, and ear pressure, symptoms consistent with exposure to an explosion and perhaps radiation. One man who had worked on the tunnels claimed he was ordered to help load dozens of burned, hairless bodies onto trucks after the event. Overhearing SS officers boast that they had tested a new weapon the world would soon hear about. For years, these accounts were dismissed as myths born of war's chaos. But after the Cold War, Soviet documents emerged that gave them new weight. A report sent directly to Stalin in March 1945 described 2 massive explosions in Thuringia with radioactive effects so severe that prisoners in the area were killed without a trace. In the 2000s, German historian Rainer Kalisch reignited the controversy with a book titled Hitler's Bomb, arguing that a team of scientists under physicist Kurt Debner, working independently of Heisenberg, may have tested a crude nuclear device. According to his theory, it was not a full-scale atomic bomb like the one dropped on Japan, but a smaller hybrid weapon that used conventional explosives to trigger a limited nuclear reaction. Soil tests from the area revealed traces of radioactive isotopes such as cesium-137 and cobalt-60 that do not occur naturally and could point to a nuclear event. If true, this suggests the possibility of a rogue SS program operating outside official channels, separate from Germany's better-known scientific establishment. Could a desperate faction of the Reich, with limited resources and a fragment of nuclear material, have succeeded in creating a low-yield nuclear explosion in a last-ditch effort to change the war's outcome? The question lingers, and with it, the haunting thought that the world may have come closer to nuclear catastrophe in 1945 than anyone ever realized. Despite the striking testimony of locals and the Soviet intelligence report, most historians and physicists remain convinced that Germany never tested a nuclear device. The evidence against the idea is strong. The most fundamental obstacle was the lack of fissile material. To achieve a nuclear explosion, a critical mass of highly enriched uranium or plutonium is required. And all captured records, along with post-war analysis, confirm that the Germans never came close to producing the necessary amounts. At best, they had managed to acquire only grams, when what was required was kilograms. Another compelling point comes from the farm hall transcripts. In 1945, 10 of Germany's most prominent nuclear scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Kurt Debner, were secretly recorded while interned at a British safehouse. When they were informed about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, their reactions revealed not triumph or recognition, but utter disbelief and confusion. Heisenberg himself expressed that he did not believe it was possible, struggling even to calculate how it might have been done. If they had overseen or even known of a nuclear test months earlier, such surprise would have been impossible to fake, especially in candid private conversations they believed were secret. Physical evidence also fails to support the nuclear test theory. The soil sample studies that claimed to reveal abnormal radioactive isotopes have been strongly disputed. In 2006, Germany's leading Federal Physics Institute conducted its own high-precision analysis of soil from the supposed test area. Their conclusion was definitive. There was no radiation beyond ordinary background levels and residual fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing and the Chernobyl disaster. A genuine nuclear blast would have left an unmistakable isotopic signature, and there was none. So what explains the stories of the flash, the shockwave, and the burned victims? The most likely explanation is that the witnesses saw the test of a massive conventional weapon, possibly a large fuel-air bomb, capable of producing a mushroom cloud and enormous destructive force. Human memory, colored by the later news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, may also have shaped and exaggerated those accounts. While the idea of Hitler's secret bomb remains a captivating mystery, the best available science suggests that it was never more than a phantom. A chilling rumor, born of desperation and chaos in the final days of the war. Far from Germany's laboratories and tunnels, in the remote and frozen reaches of the Arctic, another secret struggle was taking place. For German submarines hunting Allied convoys, accurate weather forecasts were as important as torpedoes. A sudden storm could scatter ships and give U-boats an advantage, but equally, it could doom submarines to watery graves. As Allied forces, grew more effective at destroying German weather ships. The Navy devised a bold alternative: secret land-based weather stations deep in the Arctic Circle. The most ambitious of these was Operation Schatzgräber, meaning treasure hunter, though the treasure sought was not gold but data. In September 1943, a small German expedition evaded Allied patrols and braved the ice-choked seas to land on Alexandra Land, an isolated and uninhabited island in the Franz Josef Land archipelago, far to the north of Russia. There a team of about 10 men, meteorologists, radio operators, and laborers constructed prefabricated huts and installed their sensitive instruments on a desolate gravel spit, battered by winds and locked in ice. As the endless darkness of the polar night descended in November, the station became operational. The men faced unimaginable isolation, punishing cold, and the constant threat of prowling polar bears or possible Soviet patrols, against which they laid a defensive minefield. Their only connection to the outside world was a long-range Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft that occasionally risked the dangerous flight north to drop supplies and letters. From this lonely outpost, coded weather reports were transmitted back to Naval Command, and these forecasts gave German submarines a precious edge. This obscure little station, unknown to the Allies, had become one of the most strategically important assets in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Life at was a monotonous routine of survival, boredom, and science. The men read whatever books they had, played endless games of cards, and endured a diet of canned meat, vegetables, and hard biscuits that crushed morale and left them yearning for fresh food. By the spring of 1944, the hunger for something real became overwhelming. When two men managed to kill a large polar bear, the crew celebrated, eager for the rare treat of fresh meat. The cook prepared thick steaks from the carcass, but in their excitement, the men cooked the meat only lightly, with some even eating it nearly raw. Within days, their triumph turned into horror. The cook fell violently ill first, and then nearly everyone else succumbed to fever, agonizing pain in their muscles, delirium, and violent gastrointestinal sickness. Only the medic, who had wisely avoided the fresh meat, remained healthy. He quickly identified the cause: trichinosis, a parasite, carried in the flesh of wild animals like polar bears. The men had poisoned themselves, and with their health collapsing, the vital weather transmissions stopped. A desperate radio call for help reached Germany, and the High Command, recognizing the outpost's importance, launched a dangerous rescue attempt. A Focke-Wulf Condor carrying a doctor was sent to parachute into the camp. But when the pilot saw the dire condition of the men below, he decided to attempt a landing. Against all odds, the massive Thuringian aircraft touched down on the rough Arctic tundra, damaging its landing gear in the process. Now stranded with the sick crew, the doctor treated them as best he could while the pilot and others scrambled to patch up the crippled plane. On July 11, 1944, with the men weakened but barely stable, the aircraft took off from a makeshift runway. Lifting all of them out of Alexandra Land, they left behind their huts, their equipment, their diaries, and even their minefield, a frozen time capsule of a forgotten war. The station was abandoned, a relic of desperation in the Arctic cold, where the real treasure had always been nothing more than weather. The Schatzgräber station, once seen as a vital weapon in the war, was left behind in abrupt abandonment. Its mission reduced to total failure. A top-secret Nazi base, hidden deep within enemy territory, invisible to Allied eyes, had been brought to ruin not by sabotage or bombardment, but by a single polar bear whose meat carried a parasite. For decades, the site lay frozen and forgotten, a silent monument to one of the war's strangest and most ironic defeats, until Russian researchers excavated it in 2016. Confirming a tale so improbable, it seemed more like fiction than fact. When the last shots of a war are fired, what follows is not silence, but echoes. Echoes of questions never answered, of stories that stop without endings, of lives and fates that vanish into uncertainty. The flight of Rudolf Hess into mystery, the fiery loss of the Normandie, the disappearance of U-47, the vanishing of Glenn Miller, the phantom blast in Thuringia, and the downfall of Schatzgräber are not mere side notes in the history of conflict. They are parables that reveal the true nature of war, showing that history is never a clean and orderly record arranged neatly by victors, but a sprawling, chaotic, deeply human story shaped as much by madness, delusion, accident, and incompetence, as by strategy, courage, or brilliance. These mysteries endure precisely because they defy neat conclusions. They linger in that uncertain territory between fact and speculation, where official records feel insufficient and conspiracy theories tempt with their false clarity. They expose how easily a secret order can blur into personal delusion, how governments in desperation may choose to bargain with the very criminals they claim to oppose, and how the most elaborate operations of modern militaries can unravel at the hands of something as simple and primal as nature. They remind us that for all human planning and technological power, the universe often moves with a cruel irony, as though mocking our confidence. To reflect on these events is to confront the limits of knowledge, to realize that for every archived report there may have been a whispered truth never recorded, a secret buried under the sea, or a decision made in haste that history will never preserve. They compel us to question the histories handed down to us, to probe deeper into the shadows where other stories may yet lie hidden. And in the end, they leave us with a haunting and unshakable question. After all these decades, what other secrets of that vast and terrible war are still waiting, silent and patient, to be discovered?